The impact of climate change on women is quite a thorny issue. Today, the minister spoke to women and delegates who gathered here, relating a story of how the closure of Komati Power Station did have an impact on women, particularly women in small business. But to tell us this story, I have Minister who is going to relate the story and where to from here. Minister, I'm sitting there, I'm listening, and quite a moving story. Can you relate the story of Komati in relation to the impact to ordinary people?
Well, Sophie, as you know, Komati Power Station, in terms of the integrated resource plan, was due for decommissioning in 2020. There was a pilot project there to look at how we could repurpose that power station, and also to look at the question of how we recreate livelihoods for the broader community in Komati. And the story I was telling in the session is about what happened to the women at Komati Power Station, women who would have been involved in micro enterprises, providing breakfast, lunch, refreshments, running taverns in the Komati village, providing services to workers in the power station, but also people who would be working in the broader ecosystem, so people who would have been delivering coal, doing maintenance, and so on. And when that transition occurred, there were not workers who lost their jobs. The workers were transferred to other power stations because the workers were skilled. But because the consultation process around Komati happened during the COVID period and the lockdowns, there wasn't adequate consultation with the broader village and the broader community. And so what happened was that as that market for goods and services closed, which is what Komati was, a marketplace in a sense, these women who were providing informal services found themselves without livelihoods. And I think what that story tells us is, first of all, the importance of broad consultation. Secondly, that if you want to have justice in a transition, there has to be what we call co-creation. So those who are going to be affected in the broader economic ecosystem have to be part of co-creating livelihoods and alternatives. But also, what we know is that in Komati there are still basic services that community doesn't have access to, such as a clinic, proper water supply, and so on. And so those issues impact very directly on women, because we know that women have to take care of the sick, women have to make sure there's water in the household. If women are running little food gardens, they have to make sure that their vegetables are watered. So all of these socio-economic issues affect women very directly, and that's what we mean when we talk about, have we looked at the gender impacts of the transition?
Minister, you spoke about the Presidential Climate Commission report. But where to from here? It's clear that something went horribly wrong, but where to from here?
Well, I've already taken the opportunity to meet with the partners that were involved in this. This project was being financed by the World Bank. I have had a very good meeting with them to raise with them that we need a pilot that shows what should happen, not what shouldn't happen. So we are now in discussion about how we put the situation right. It means that we've got to go back to consulting with the community more broadly about other forms of economic development. It means we've got to look into the broader ecosystem around Komati Power Station, what kinds of economic development could be supported, and we've got to make sure that there's training and financing available to develop new forms of enterprises and new forms of ownership for those who were in the broader economic value chain. And of course, I think the big lesson from this, Sophie, is that you have to front load the socio-economic developments before you embark on the decommissioning, because if you don't front load those developments, then you will find a situation where unintentionally people who may not have been directly employed but would have been directly benefiting from the existence of the power station are going to find their livelihoods destroyed.
Many people are saying the developing countries are being pushed to come up with programs and move from fossil fuel to this clean energy, and we are not ready. This Komati story, doesn't it reflect a reality that sometimes the developing countries are being pushed to adopt programs or approve programs that will have impact later on, particularly the criticism always directed to the World Bank and the IMF?
Well, I think first of all we need to be clear. Komati Power Station was decommissioned because it was old. I suppose we need to ask questions as to why the new coal-fired power stations like Medupi and Kusile weren't ready in time. But that's a conversation for another day. But I think the key thing that we're discussing today is how do we make sure that South Africans benefit from the transition? How do we make sure that South Africans experience the transition at a pace and in a manner which our country can afford? And I think that what our Just Energy Transition Implementation Plan does, and we've learned a lot from the historical mistakes, is it asks questions about if we know in the long term that a province like Mpumalanga is vulnerable not only to the physical effects of climate change but the transition risk. How do we start now to create different forms of economic employment and different forms of economic development so that communities in Mpumalanga are not left behind?